So with no further ado, why don't we just have do a nice warm welcome to Professor Wang.
Good afternoon. Happy to have you here. Thank you for the introduction. This is also collaborative work with one of my PhD students, Dui Jingsu, and as you see, it's becoming a global venture, right, with a Chinese lady. Having 3 universities might sound nice, and if you work at 3 universities, it might be a pleasure to do so. But on the other hand, it's a lot of troubles, you may be sure. So if you have to move from Spain to Belgium and back to Spain, so it gives you some troubles too. Anyway, so let's have a look at the issue for today. What I want to do today is the following thing. You have probably heard about open innovation before. That's one stream of literature. On the other hand, you have another stream of literature which maybe not, where you might not be familiar with. That's globalization of R&D, because you see more and more large companies are moving in the direction of China, of India, of Singapore, and so on. And so I would like to combine the 2 literature streams to see what kind of agenda, research agenda we can have if we combine the 2 literature streams. So, sorry. If we look at the agenda for today, I would like to have a look first at facts about open innovation, about R&D globalization. I would like to focus on the framework of a PhD project, and then introduce a little bit open innovation if this still is necessary. But probably you'll have more to learn about R&D globalization. And then I would look at the limitations of both literature streams. Then see how we can combine them. Can we enrich the open innovation framework, which you might know already, by insights from R&D globalization? On the other hand, can we change our understanding of multinationals using insights from open innovation? And then finally, can we move in the direction of globalization towards open innovation model for multinationals, right? So that's more or less what I'm going to do today. But feel free to question. You see there are different blocks. What I suggest is that I go through a block and then raise your finger whenever you have a question, right? Now let's have a look at some facts and trends, right? The first thing is, if you had a look at open innovation, and probably you did, and you probably had already some presentations so far, you know that most of the time they are talking, or the researchers are talking about large companies. The best known examples are IBM, Intel, Xerox, and Procter & Gamble. That's probably the talks that Henry has been doing, right? But then also, if you look at Europe, we have similar stories about Philips, Nokia, Unilever, BT, and many others, which you might not know, but it's just a similar story, right? Now, the next point is large firms, or without any exception, multinationals, right? All these companies are global companies. And then multinationals, that's the next point, multinationals are globalizing their R&D activities. You might have read some articles about where IBM is doing its research, Hewlett-Packard, who is predominantly in India, but also other companies that are doing R&D around the globe. And so a very interesting point is then that the open innovation literature, like Henry Chesbrough, who is talking about openness, so trying to tap in external sources of knowledge, is pretty silent about this geographical dimension. He says, go and look for external sources of knowledge, but he is not talking about where to find it. And nowadays, if you see these companies as globalizing their R&D activities, this location of R&D becomes pretty important. So external knowledge is important, but no indication where the multinational should search for external knowledge. And so I would like to fill in that gap. So I will focus on that gap between the 2 literature streams. Now first, because I'm talking about gaps, just to make sure that you understand what I'm talking about, this is an example of Nokia. Where are the R&D centers of Nokia? Well, you could think in Helsinki, right. In Helsinki, you have a huge R&D lab, but that's only part of what Nokia is doing. I'm just not going to go through all of them, but you see Bangalore, Beijing, Berkeley, of course. Cambridge, Helsinki, and so on. So they have many more than just a few European sites. So that's for Nokia. But then we can move to another one like Novartis in the pharmaceuticals. You see the same things. You see corporate research in Singapore, Siena, Loyola, Basel, and then Basel should be with a Z. And then other one, so you have the pharmaceutical development, which is also located in different parts of the world. So we have one from mobile phones. We have one for pharmaceuticals. What about fast-moving consumer goods? Well, Unilever, you see the same story, right? And then maybe a little bit more strange for you is that's a Chinese company. Chinese companies making white goods. White goods like refrigerators and so on. This is a Chinese company, a pretty big one. And they have also, not only in China, 2 sites, but also in Japan, also in the United States, also in Europe, they have different R&D sites. So you see even Chinese companies are moving or globalizing the R&D, although it's very limited nowadays, and it's only for a few large companies, but they are going the same direction. If you go for HP, well, I don't have a chart, but you see the same story here for HP. So I hope with these examples that I can show you that globalization of R&D is pretty predominant right nowadays, right? Now the next point is why these companies are globalizing their R&D. And they do that for different reasons. And if you look, for instance, for China, you see that 13% for all the multinationals investing R&D, investing their R&D centers in China, there are about 13% for that go there because there's a proximity of technological clusters and academic institutes. Most of them, so 30% is for markets and customers, so customizing your products because of the Chinese market is different than the American market, for instance. Proximity of production facilities is another very important one. Low-cost skilled labor is another one, and then qualified workers is another one. You see in highly developed countries like Japan, the United States, that this proportion of the technological clusters and academic institutes is larger, right? And probably also in China and India, we will see that this share will increase over time. So a number of reasons why companies are globalizing. And I want to focus later on this part because I'm focusing on doing research abroad because of the proximity of leading-edge institutes.
Quick question.
Sure.
For this set of data, is it the primary breakdown for the primary reason, or I mean, I could imagine there are multiple reasons that would be combined.
Yeah, this is the primary reason, right?
Primary.
Yeah. Okay. Now you're right. So you can have different reasons, but this is primary reason. Otherwise, it would not add up till 100, right? And this is for a large set of 1,000 biggest R&D spenders, right? So this is for large multinational companies. Now, if you look at the difference between the home-based sites and the foreign sites, there's still quite a big difference. You have core technology and full development capabilities, 40% at home and only 15% abroad. So it's still quite different. And you see 32% is for a center with specific expertise, and you see here 23% for customization for local markets. So you see the real research is most of the time done still at home, and only for a minority, let us say, of cases only done in the sites abroad. Now, if you're interested in China, just some figures I got recently from China is if you look at the GDP growth, it's enormous compared to Europe and the United States. Probably similar for, we have similar results for India. But if you look at the R&D expenditure in China, it's even growing exponentially. Similar, so if the input is growing, so probably also the output, and then you see that the patent applications are growing very rapidly. And that's what we are interested in, new research labs in China per year, and you see it grows from virtually nothing in the 90s to 110, 120 R&D sites from foreign companies in 1 year. So that's enormous. So these are the trends. If you think, okay, there may be one side remark because this is important. You might think that the world is flat, that R&D is globalizing everywhere. That's not true, right? The world is what we call spiky, or what at least that's what Richard Florida is saying. That means if you see the scientific publications there, but then you have the patents, you also see that the world is spiky in the sense that not everywhere, not in each country we have, of course, these patents growing. It's more like in the Far East, in Europe and the United States where it's concentrated, right? So if I'm talking about globalization, it's about these spikes. It's not about globalization all over the world, right? Good. So these are a few facts. So let's move on. A research framework for the PhD work I'm doing, and maybe it's not really related to open innovation, is the following thing, and you will understand it quite quickly. What we try to do on the first thing is you have the national innovation system or regional innovation system in a particular country, and since I'm coming from Europe, I try to compare European with Asian national innovation systems. The second level is the multinational level. So you have a European multinational here with its headquarters and the research facilities in Europe. And what you see traditionally is the following thing. You see that research has been doing, so you see that there is a kind of relationship between the national innovation system on the one hand and the interaction with companies on the other hand. So how companies can benefit from the national innovation system is typical research literature that has been going on for years and years, even decades right now. So, yeah, sorry.
What do you call national innovation system? It's national labs or what?
No, it's broader than that. Who has any idea what is a national innovation system? Nobody heard about the term before? Regional innovation system, national innovation system? Okay, that's good to know. This is, let's say, the overall infrastructure you have, and also values, because it's not only the hardware but also the software. It's the knowledge infrastructure you have in a country or in a part of a country, could be regional too, and also, of course, the values you have around innovation. For instance, here in the Valley, here you have in California a more entrepreneurial, let's say, values than, for instance, in what we have in Europe, right? So this also counts as the soft side of a national innovation system. So the attitude towards entrepreneurship, the attitude towards innovation, and so on. But also the R&D labs, right? The capital venture, corporate venturing, venture capitalist funds, there's all these kind of institutes you have around and which can help companies to innovate, right? So you have an interaction between companies. Think about, you have Microsoft, you have many small ventures here in California, and the overall, let's say, R&D structure you have, universities you have, institutes you have, but also the values, the attitudes towards entrepreneurship and so on, right? And this, you may be sure, is quite different from country to country. Not only on the institute side, so on the R&D side, but also the values. Values are pretty different. One major difference, I think, between California or the United States and in general and Europe is that, for instance, we don't tolerate failure in Europe. If you try to establish a new venture, you establish your own company and you fail, you're considered yourself as a failure. So socially you're punished. And it's good you're laughing, because that means here in California it's quite different. But you can imagine if you start up a company here, you have for sure a second and a third chance, right? People will appreciate you, right? In Europe, it's different. That makes a huge difference. Why in Europe we have less people trying to be entrepreneurial than here. Although maybe we have the same scientific infrastructure. We have a lot of scientific papers, right? We have even Nobel Prize winners, as well as in the United States. But the entrepreneurial output, the number of new companies we set up, is quite low. That has something to do with the values, right? So I hope this is like how this environment is shaping, let's say, companies and the innovating behavior in companies, right? This is a classical team. I'm not going to work on this one here. Then the other one, which is classical, is we make a comparison between national innovation systems in developed countries and in rapidly developing countries like in China and India and so on. That's also something which I don't want to look at. But then you have something interesting. Nowadays, you have this globalization of R&D going on, and you see that European or American multinationals are moving towards, let's say, China or India. And then a number of interesting questions pop up. So multinationals, so let's say American or US-based or European multinationals are investing in BRIC countries, or BRIC is Brazil, Russia, India, and China, for different reasons. Tapping into, well, we have seen them, right, on the chart. Tapping into local R&D for infrastructure and resources is one of the main reasons. So the question is how you can connect as a European company, as a European multinational like Philips, how you can connect with the local knowledge partners. Because you go to China to connect to, let's say, one of these leading institutes, right? Or you go to India to connect to a number of leading universities. So the other question then that you have is how multinationals in developed regions can profit from newly developing national innovation systems. So how governments in newly developing regions can increase the interest of technological advanced MNEs. And that's a new question, for instance, for the Chinese government. That's also why I'm involved in this research, because the Chinese government is questioning how they can change the regional innovation system in Shanghai and in Beijing to attract multinationals. You have already heard about the US government thinking, or the Californian government thinking about how to attract Indian and Chinese and other companies to stay here in the valley. So that's what the Chinese government is doing. So another point then is how R&D of multinationals, which are doing quite some interesting R&D over there, in China, for instance, how this R&D based of multinationals based in developed regions affect local regional innovation systems. So how to optimally design this regional innovation system to profit from the multinational investments. That's something which is quite new. And then finally, what we should ask in Europe is how the regional innovation system in Europe, for instance in the Netherlands or in Belgium, should be adapted to new global knowledge economy. Because you see that lots of companies like Philips, Novartis, and others are moving to the east. So what is the consequences for the regional innovation system in the west? And the last idea from this framework is the following. Let's switch from European multinationals to Chinese multinationals. And then you see that if Chinese companies, Chinese multinationals move to the west, they develop R&D activities in the proximity of world-leading R&D infrastructure, and then how to connect with local knowledge centers. That's a new question which will probably, you have seen the higher example, right? So the higher example, so that's one example that we can show. And then how multinationals in BRIC countries can profit from regional innovation systems in world-class technology regions, like, for instance, here the Valley. So how these governments, Chinese governments in this case, can help these MNEs to tap into these world-class science and technology regions. So this is like a new set of questions you can ask when multinationals are globalizing. Finally, of course, you also have how foreign direct investments of these Chinese multinationals can be used by other local companies or organizations, how the government can change this regional innovation system from foreign R&D by local multinationals. And of course, again, you have to ask the same question if multinationals from newly developing countries are moving to the West, how can you shape the regional innovation system that way? So a number of questions, quite theoretically, I'm sorry about that. But it's a whole framework which is quite new, where governments and also companies have to adapt to. And then, I don't want to focus too long on that because I want to focus on open innovation. Just a number of consequences for the governments. If these are the knowledge centers in a particular region, and these are the companies in a particular region, the old model, at least in Europe, and probably also in the United States, I'm not pretty sure, but I think it was the same model, was we have knowledge centers domestically, which you're going to use only for domestic firms. United States infrastructure for United States firms. And this was the old paradigm, local for local, right? So you have built centers of excellence and you try to stimulate the competitiveness of American companies by having this local infrastructure. Now, if companies are globalizing, and for sure, the United States is a big country, and you have critical mass, but I'm coming from a country with 10 million people. So you can imagine, it's only like 250 kilometers on 200 kilometers. That's pretty big, right? So what is domestic here in a time where multinationals are globalizing their R&D? And so then it becomes pretty tough for, at least for governments, for a government of a small country, to continue to think that way. They want, of course, to spend money for their own economy to improve, let's say, the competitiveness of their own companies, but that no longer works. So you have to look in different directions. So maybe you have to look at knowledge centers abroad where your companies can tap into the latest technology, in the latest science. And it's, of course, not always in Belgium. It can be in the United States, can be in the rest of Europe, can be in Japan, but can also nowadays be in China. And so the question is how you're going to stimulate internationalization of R&D of domestic firms abroad, right? So how you can reduce the cost of international R&D sourcing. So instead of doing it all at home, you might stimulate your companies to get resources elsewhere. And that's for government, for the government, for policymakers, quite different to switch the mind, right? But that's basically what China and India has been doing for a long time. Now we better switch our mind to a similar way of thinking. And the other way is still more difficult. Why not setting up a domestic center of knowledge and use it to attract foreign companies, to get critical mass and to become a center of excellence around the world? So the new paradigm should be local for global. Stimulate foreign companies to make use of the local knowledge centers. Stimulate them to relocate and extend their R&D centers in your country. And so you can become really a world center where you have enough critical mass, not only by domestic firms, because that would be foolish in the Belgium example. We only have, let's say, 20 big companies, that's it, right? So that's foolish. But if you have sufficiently European and American and Chinese companies flocking together and working around or doing R&D together with, let's say, top of leading edge centers, then of course you can play a role not only in Belgium, but also in the world. And then finally, but that's a little bit, let's see if I have, oh, no, I don't have anything there. More and more you see that nowadays you have to work, let's say, in an international context. Large R&D projects are no longer national. Also large R&D centers are no longer national. Think about the CERN, where you have all these kind of physical experiments in Switzerland, is no longer a Swiss owned laboratory, but is basically an infrastructure which is earned by, let's say, large international scientific associations, right? So the world is changing quite rapidly, and also for policymakers, this is a quite thought-provoking way of thinking, right? Now, I promised, because that was a kind of introduction, so let's finish that off. This is more for policymakers, this is a framework. But now let's come back to our original question about open innovation on one hand and globalization of companies on the other hand. Now, open innovation, everybody knows what open innovation is. You had this kind of courses from Henry? Okay, that saves me some time. I'm gonna go fly through it, right? Open innovation is the purpose of inflows and outflows of knowledge. Watch out, knowledge is not necessarily technological knowledge. I know most of you are coming from science, from a technical background. So knowledge is not necessarily technical knowledge, right? I see many companies doing nice open innovation of open business models with customer knowledge, market insights, new business models, beautiful examples from low tech, which has nothing to do with technology, but it's knowledge-based, right? To accelerate internal innovation and also expand the markets for external use of innovation. So I'm not going to explain that. You have the classical closed innovation system. You have the changes in the environment, which probably Henry has been explaining at length, right? And then I just want to focus here on the things that are going to be interesting for the rest of my story. The interesting point is not that it's so open here, because we know this kind of inflows, right? But the interesting point here is that you have the possibility as a company to choose between external technology inflows completely in the beginning, in the fuzzy front end of the funnel, or completely at the end, where technology is proven. Here you have huge uncertainty, right? Funnel is there to reduce the uncertainty. So if you have an external research project with a university, that means that uncertainty is still pretty high, but the cost is pretty low. Here you're going to invest $100,000, $200,000, and you're going to spend it somewhere at a particular university or a particular research lab, and you will know something more about a particular technology after a year or 2 years. But that's peanuts for a big company. Here you have technology acquisition, and you will not pay a few $100,000. You will pay something like a 60 million US dollars to get a small company, to acquire a small company. But this is proven technology, and as a large company, you can leverage this kind of know-how across your manufacturing, across your distribution channels, so you still can earn quite some money there. But the advantage is here that you have this flexibility. Now, later on, we will see that R&D globalization is focusing much on the front end, because this is research, but not on the development. So the D here, they are not focusing on. And so open innovation might be quite interesting, because it's not focusing on this part, but also focusing on the back end, let us say, of the funnel. And then open innovation is, of course, also about outsourcing your own R&D, so the inside out movement. So you can license it out, you can have technological spin-offs, and that's also new for R&D globalization, because R&D globalization is only at the insourcing side. It's about tapping into local research in particular sites of the world, but it's not about how to improve or how to monetize your technology in different ways than just making your own products, right? So this is what we should know about open innovation. Very short, but you know that stuff. Probably who has ever heard about who has taken some courses in globalization of R&D? Okay, that's pretty new for you. Okay, good. So let's see if we can give you some basic ideas about what globalization of R&D is. Globalization of R&D is not new, right? It started already in the 60s, but it started seriously in the 80s, let us say, and then there was a trend towards R&D globalization. First, it started as adaptation to local market conditions. So most American companies that went to Europe in the 60s had already this kind of technology, had this kind of R&D globalization. So it was more, originally it was more development, because you developed a product or you changed the product a little bit for the European customers, so that it was adapted to their needs and not to the American customer needs. So that's not very profound, that's not very science-driven, let us say. So adaptation to local conditions rather than fundamental research as a main mandate of overseas R&D units. And so you see it's a home-based exploitation. So what means you have done our research in your home country. So American companies have been doing research here, and then they export their products to other countries. They do some development to adapt the product elsewhere, but that's it. So it's home-based exploitation. You create an advantage, a competitive advantage here, based on science, based on technology, and then you export your products abroad. So the multinationals are a vehicle for technology unilateral transfer, or unilateral technology transfer, sorry, and dissemination. So they have technology over here, and they transfer it to their subsidiaries. And that's for, you may be sure, it's for instance, for Europe in the 60s and the 70s, it was a main source of innovation, because we learned a lot from the American multinationals. And nowadays, the Chinese and the Indian companies are doing the same, right? So they learn a lot because multinationals are just transferring this technology to local subsidiaries. Now, since the 90s, there is a growing importance of the affiliate activities. So abroad, they are doing not only development, but also more and more research. in generating new knowledge and competences for the multinational. So this is what we call home-based augmenting or competence creating activities, research activities abroad. And so it's not only the headquarters and the research, central research that's going to do some research, but also subsidiaries abroad that are going to develop some research and which might be interesting not only locally, but also for the company as such, right? So you have not a unilateral transfer, but let's say a bilateral way of information between the subsidiaries on one hand and the R&D headquarters on the other hand. So then we have a kind of new concept, which is called a transnational. What is a transnational? Well, that's at the point that it's come from Bartlett and Goschel. So if you're interested, you always can refer to Bartlett and Goschel. And those authors have introduced the concept of transnational. What is a transnational? Well, basically it's about giving different, they give different roles to the subsidiaries in terms of R&D globalization. I know I don't go into detail here because it would take me too much time, but basically what they do is if you look at Procter & Gamble subsidiaries, you will see, for instance, that Procter & Gamble in Germany will take the responsibility of the research and development for Pampers. So for a particular product category, the subsidiary is taking over the research for a particular product category. So the R&D is not only done centrally, not only done in Cincinnati, but is also done elsewhere in the world. But that's only for particular types of product categories. And so what we're going to talk right now is about the latest innovation in this kind of R&D globalization literature, and that's called a metanational. It comes from Doss and his co-authors from INSEAD. So these professors come from INSEAD in Paris. And so here we go a little bit further, and what you see is that the latest development is that companies, multinationals, try to tap into geographically dispersed but locally embedded locally embedded knowledge, and that they try to leverage this knowledge which is local into something which is interesting for the company as a whole, right? So and it goes further than the transnational because they set up separate and dedicated research departments. So what we have seen in the beginning, like these research departments, which are all over the world nowadays, in these different companies like Nokia and Unilever, that's basically what also the Metanational is focusing at. So they try to have this kind of research departments, which are no longer in the United States or in Europe, but also all over the world. So if we now focus on the Metanational, right, this latest trend, they start from the observation that knowledge is increasingly dispersed, just like Henry Chesbrough has independently been advocating. National economic development efforts of different governments help in explaining that. Strategic knowledge industries in several companies that have been advanced also. If you look, for instance, in Taiwan, they have been advancing nanoelectronics with government support. The ease of communication and access to communication is very important by ICT, by the internet, and so on. Multinational companies as teachers, because multinationals transfer technology towards less developed countries. Overseas outsourcing, contract manufacturing, and so on. Think about all this outsourcing that American ICT companies have been doing to India. Global customers are very important because they try to spread this kind of knowledge, and then also industry convergence, which helped a lot. So they're just a background slide and showing that a lot has been changing and that knowledge is becoming increasingly dispersed, just like Henry has been advocating, but independent from this literature stream. And then the question is how you can tap, how you can make money out of, how you can get an advantage, a competitive advantage from knowledge. And that's something interesting. Knowledge is everywhere in all industries, so it's important, and it's in all industries. But leading firms are accustomed to project homegrown knowledge. So remember, the first steps in internationalization was you do R&D at the home country, in the centralized R&D labs, and you export this the knowledge, you diffuse this knowledge to other countries. But then you see the following thing. As knowledge becomes dispersed, by the way, you will have these slides in PDF form after the lecture. But sources of knowledge are nowadays increasingly dispersed. So because of this diffusion of knowledge across the globe. And the next point is very important. Competitively valuable knowledge is complex and hard to move. If you can move knowledge pretty easily, that means that an Indian can use it and a Chinese can use it just as an American can do. And so the competitive advantage is pretty difficult. But if knowledge is locally embedded and what we call tacit, right, then it becomes much more difficult to transport it, to transfer it. And that's also to create a competitive value, to create a competitive advantage. It's really interesting that knowledge is complex and hard to move, hard to transfer, right? Yeah, sorry.
Do you make a distinction between this kind of knowledge and scalable knowledge in terms of deployment within a country rather than?
I think scalability of knowledge is still something different, but it might be related to it. Tacit and contextual knowledge just means that well, if it's contextual, it means you can develop it in a particular context, and it's hard to transfer it in another context or to use it in another context. In this sense, it could be scalable, right? Like you could not use it in different contexts. Tacit knowledge means you really have to do the things, you really have to be there, and you really have to have face-to-face contacts to transfer the knowledge, right? If it's scalable or not, that's probably a different issue.
So,
Yeah, go ahead.
So when I'm reading this, I'm thinking of consulting as
Yeah, okay.
An example of this, but it's not scalable. Do you have an example where it's tacit, but it's still scalable?
But yeah, but I don't agree. Why you think that consultancy is not scalable?
Because it's some people's time, some very knowledgeable people's time.
No, I think it's a very nice comment, or a very nice question, but I don't agree. Let's think about McKinsey, right? So, and if you don't agree, please tell me. Let's think about McKinsey, right? What is McKinsey doing? You have, let's say in Manhattan, one of these McKinsey offices, and they are, of course, because of the environment, pretty strong in financial services, right? So they develop at that particular point, in that particular area, they develop a new financial instrument or a new financial tool. It costs millions and millions, right? Because they have to be leading edge in the world, so they have to be better than all their competitors, right? So what are you going to do if you're McKinsey? You're just going to develop it over there and then work for a few clients here in the United States? Of course not. What you're going to do is you're going to try, that's the difficult part, but you're going to try to put it into an ICT system and make sure that everybody around the globe in McKinsey can get access to it. So that everybody knows, okay, if you have this kind of financial problems, we have some tool to provide solutions and to create value out for your clients, right? And if you're in Australia or in Belgium or in China, who cares? As long as you have this kind of defined problem, you always can get access to this tool. You even can call these people that have developed it and that can help you. So is it scalable? Yes, it's scalable. You can use it across the globe. That's the way how these companies make money. They leverage their global presence, right? Because clients all over the world have similar problems, and you can use this tool for clients with similar problems. The only problem is you have to make sure that you don't work case-based, right? If it's fully customized, then of course you have a problem. But that's probably what McKinsey never wants to do. You're probably better as a small SME that can work fully customized for a particular type of client. But McKinsey will go for, let's say, scalable products which you can use in different applications, different geographical areas, right? Make sense?
Yep.
Okay. So it's very important, right? And success depends on innovation using complex knowledge. So these two are related. Finally, that leads to us to the conclusion that firms are thus moving project homegrown knowledge. Firms are moving from project homegrown knowledge, so the original way of thinking, towards learning from the world. Yeah. So they're going to tap into different pockets of knowledge, local pockets of knowledge around the world. Sorry.
Can you give us an example of what is complex and contextual knowledge? Is it knowledge associated with regulations or something
Could be.
specific? But
Could be. We have some companies called Suez. Everybody knows Suez? No, so this is one of the major electricity and gas distribution companies in Europe. It's a French-based company, and sorry, Suez. Yeah, it's a huge company, by the way. So it's a little bit surprising that only a few people know it. And one of the skills these people have, one of the complex knowledge this company has, is how to deal with governments. Because if you deal with gas distribution, electricity distribution, one of the major players is of course governments. And this takes complex knowledge, right? But this might be a little bit too abstract. So let's come to something which everybody knows. How do you explain a kid to ride a bike? That's complex knowledge. We even don't know how to explain. You don't have a manual and don't explain to your kid how to do it. You just put him on a bike and there he goes, right? So, but you have to do it. It's learning by doing. It's complex. You have to learn it for years before you have a full control over your bike and so on. So that's basically what it is. How do you learn how to make sculptures, right? Well, you have to do it over years, and how you have to paint similar things, right? Yeah.
Maybe it sounds silly, but like, is there an R&D on how to deal with governments?
Well, it's not research, and it's not development in the technical sense, but you may be sure there are huge. The way how you deal with governments is something you can learn, right? And you have manuals for sure in Suez how to deal with it. What is the procedures? So you have steps, and they are trained people in doing that. What are the tricks to handle with tricks? Well, what is the business of dealing with governments? And that's, of course, has nothing to do with technical issues, or not that much with technical issues, but it's, of course, a typical way of generating, it's a managerial issue, right? And you can learn it. There are manuals for sure in Suez about that. They train people year after year about that. So there's a way of doing things. There are a lot of do's and don'ts, and beyond that, you have, let's say, a whole way of dealing with governments. And that's also why it's complex. You have to learn it from one experienced guy to the next novice, right? So, and the guy who has to learn has to go together with an experienced guy. So you work in teams to transfer these technologies from one guy to the other guy, right? But it exists. It's less tangible. It's not exact knowledge, but it's there. Some companies are extremely successful. Other companies just fail. So something is there in the company which explains it. And it's not completely hidden. I mean, it's not a black box. If you go into the company, you see why they are successful, because they train the people, they have knowledge how to do that. Similar for McKinsey. A lot of things it's complex knowledge. These management tools are not easy to teach, but you can do that, right? Okay, let's move on. So what is finally Metanational? So pockets of underexploited technology and market knowledge, because it's not only technology knowledge, it's market knowledge, around the world that is locally imprisoned, right? So it's imprisoned, it's contextual, it's tacit, it's embedded in the local context, and it's not codified. Therefore, it can create value if you can tap into these local communities of knowledge, right? So if you can tap into and connect to these pockets of imprisoned knowledge, it would fuel a powerful new source of innovation. That's what the Metanational says. So you have to be where the knowledge is, and that means diffused knowledge in these spikes, right? So conclusion is R&D globalization forces firms to start open innovation activities in an international and multicultural setting. So because you have to go into these locally and present knowledge. So you have to go locally there in China and in India and in Europe and the United States to tap into these local networks. And that's, of course, open innovation, because you have to get external knowledge in an international setting. But it's different from Henry's setting, because he is only focusing at somewhere, external knowledge, which is somewhere there, right? But we don't know where. But no, this literature stream says exactly, you have to look where it is, where the knowledge is available. And it's in a multicultural setting, and it's in an international setting. And so the question is now, so that's for me, let's say, the starting point, how can we combine these two literature streams? How are we going to change our view on open innovation? So let's move on to give you some more information about the Metanational. Well, the Metanational, what is new about the new Metanational is that they split up, let's say, the company, the multinational, in 3 layers. The first one is the sensing layer, or here it's called prospecting, but we call it sensors. So first you have to identify and access new competences, innovative technologies, and lead market knowledge. So this is the sensing network of a company. This is completely new, because in the older theory, you didn't have this kind of separate R&D activities. This is, let's say, the separate R&D activities to sense the world for new technologies. Second is, once you have technology, once you have access to technology, you still have to do something with it, right? So you have to integrate scattered capabilities and emerging market opportunities to pioneer new products and services. So that's the entrepreneurial act, to do something, to create new products with the newly available information. And then finally, the more classical thing is, once you have this new product, then of course you optimize the size and configuration of the operations for efficiency. So there's the global manufacturing and so on, which we know already for a long time. Now the interesting part is, this is open innovation, because you have to sense, you have to tap into local and present knowledge somewhere, right? Somewhere in China, somewhere in India, somewhere in Europe. But the rest of the funnel, because you can look at the funnel now, which is 90 degrees rotated, I'm sorry. This is all closed, because you do that within a company. The sensing, so the development of a product, and finally coming here with a new product, is nothing else than a closed innovation system. So the fuzzy front end is open, but the rest of the funnel is closed, right? You can still do it in a different way if you want to look at, this is the sensing unit, so you bring it together in what they call the magnet. A magnet is like an entrepreneurial act where you have one major project where you create a new product. And once you create a new product, you're going to manufacture it and distribute it all over the world according to your subsidiary structure. Now, how do you work? I just put it on one slide. It's a slide from Dos himself. So first you have to prospect the world for new capabilities and lead market knowledge. Once you have done that, you plug in to learn locally embedded knowledge. You set up magnets. So the second step is you set up magnets to bring together pieces of knowledge that are dispersed around the world. You innovate by melding dispersed capabilities and market knowledge. You relay innovations into the operations network, so that's the third step. And you use your global operations to leverage the Metanational innovations rather than to project home orthodoxies. So this is in a nutshell what the Metanational is doing, but this is, let us say, the state of the art of globalization and R&D nowadays, right? Now, let's move on, because that's, so far we only have a short look at open innovation and a look at the open innovation, the globalization of R&D. Now the question is how we can link, and I will have 3 questions for you. Oh, let me see, I think something went wrong here. Okay, now let me just continue, sorry. Okay, I'm sorry. Open innovation, on the one hand, shows nicely why and how to source outside knowledge. I hope Henry has given you quite some examples there. And I think this is the major contribution of Henry, that he shows why you have to tap into external knowledge and how you can do that. The problem is if you relate it to internationalization of R&D, it does not tell us anything about where outside partners are located and how to get access to and absorb geographically dispersed and locally embedded knowledge. That's a big problem. If you look at the internationalization of R&D, it considers a company as a multinational, which is Henry not really doing, and international strategy plays a crucial role. It shows why companies locate their R&D centers, particularly in particular places around the globe, but it has also disadvantages. It does not have an advanced view of how to tap into external sources of technology, which is Henry doing, right? And it does only consider open innovation at the fuzzy front end, not along the innovation funnel like Henry is doing. So the question is now, can we combine both, right? So there's, according to me at least, there's a serious gap, right? So a gap here. The sentence in italics really show a major gap into advance. We should really advance open innovation in that direction. And there's a gap over here too, because if we know, let's say, what Henry Chesbrough has been saying about open innovation, we know that this is something which should be in there in the internationalization of R&D. So finally, if we wrap it up, so it could be like, this is covered by the internationalization of R&D, by the globalization of R&D, only the fuzzy front end, not the end of the funnel, the back end of the funnel is not covered. So, and I think this is also a major handicap, a major problem in the globalization of R&D. So I come to my research questions. How the recent literature about R&D globalization can enrich our understanding of open innovation. That's my first point. Second point I'm going to look at is how insights from open innovation framework can enrich our understanding of current innovation management in the multinationals, so the other way around. And finally, but this is only a few questions I have, is from R&D globalization, can we move from the R&D globalization towards a broader open innovation model for multinationals? Question mark. So let's move on. Let's focus on the first question. So how globalization of R&D can enrich our open innovation framework? Well, first, large firms, like I told before, or multinationals, they tap into globally distributed sources of knowledge. Can be science, can be technology, but don't forget it can be also design, can be fashion, because it can be market insight, customer intimacy, can be different things. Right? It's not only technology and science, because here I have been focusing on science, but it can be different things. And then, of course, once you think about companies, large companies as multinationals, then you have, of course, what are interesting R&D locations for a firm, so that's a new question. You have to tackle that problem, which is not tackled in open innovation. And then also how to tap effectively in local R&D communities around the globe. And if you say local R&D communities, you say also cultural differences. So culture is crucial, I think, in introducing an open innovation. Not only because, for instance, open innovation in Europe is probably something different than open innovation in the United States and in Asia. And a nice detail might be that I was giving a lecture in Japan about open innovation. And one of the professors in the audience just asked me, or just made a comment. He said, "Look, it's very strange." He said, "You have a very American way of looking at open innovation." And he was explaining, open innovation is like a transaction for you. He says, you need some external technology, and you make a transaction with an external partner. Well, he says in Japan it doesn't work like that. In Japan, we go for long-term arrangements. It takes a year before you trust your partner, and then after a long period of socialization, right? And then or you can work together with this partner for the next 10 years, but you don't break it down after one transaction, right? So you see that the way you think about open innovation, the way you think about making relationships with partners affects open innovation thinking. So it has a cultural background, right? And so open innovation, like we understand it in the United States, is not transferable to China or to Japan just like this. Another issue is, what is the effective number of R&D locations? Because you might think about, okay, we need something from China, we need something from Europe, we need something from Australia, but each time you have a separate R&D location somewhere else in the world, it adds cost and it adds communication cost. And the more R&D centers you have, the more the coordination costs will go, because you have exponentially possible. So the communication possibilities are growing exponentially with each R&D sites that comes with it. And so the people from so Dos and Williamson has been working on that. So the value of the number of R&D sites is decreasing after with each site, and the cost is increasing exponentially because of the coordination between all these sites. So you can imagine if you have 100 R&D sites, it just becomes a burden, right? So you have to limit the number of sites. But this will, if the number is small or large, will depend on a number of factors, which I'm not gonna explain today. But it's interesting to see that the number of sites is an interesting topic as such, right? Let's continue. So how to transfer and integrate effectively knowledge from different parts of the world within a multinational, that's a very important thing. You don't have that, of course, when you think centrally like Henry did before, but once you have different R&D sites, you have to think about how to integrate, how to transfer and integrate that within a company in an effective way. Can you also think about task specialization between these R&D centers? Because R&D centers, of course, will not do the same thing. They will highly differentiate probably. So how do you do that? How you make a kind of strategy so that you can differentiate among these different partners? And how you link R&D with operational units. So across the funnel, how do you do that, right? So it's still a very important thing, because these operational units are organized across as a subsidiaries. The R&D is organized as R&D sites, which are not collocated all the time. Sometimes they are collocated, sometimes they are not. And so you create a new way, a new difficulty there to communicate between R&D and operational units. And so different cultures, I have mentioned them, different time zones, sorry.
I'm just wondering, on the previous slide you were talking about the need to transfer and integrate knowledge from different...
Sorry, here, yeah?
From different R&D centers within a single
Yeah,
community.
sure.
But I mean, if part of the motivation for globalizing R&D in the first place is that a lot of this knowledge is tacit and fundamentally hard to transfer, does the fact that you sort of have a single corporate entity managing it change that fundamentally? I mean, change the ability to transfer that knowledge?
Okay.
Because you have a single research organization.
That's a very good point, and because of time limits, I don't have the time to make it explicit, or to make it 100% explicit, but it's a very good point. If knowledge is contextual, and if knowledge is tacit, you have to work on what we call decontextualization and recontextualization, because otherwise it's not transferable, and tacit knowledge has to be codified in one way or another, otherwise it's not transferable neither. And so it's a very important thing that you learn to do this kind of stuff, right? So, and if you don't do it, it makes no sense in a multinational. So how companies are doing that, how companies are decontextualizing, and how they are codifying, let's say, tacit knowledge. And that can happen through socialization. So there are books like Nonaka and Takeuchi, or two Japanese people that have, in the 90s, been working on that. So, but this has nothing to do with internationalization. It just has to do with knowledge transfer, right? So Nonaka and Takeuchi. And the knowledge firm it's called the knowledge firm. So it's one of the few Japanese books that really have conquered the world. So, but it's really an interesting book about tacit knowledge. So, and indeed, you're completely right. So in a multinational, you have to do these kind of things. That's why, for instance, knowledge base of knowledge management ICT. No, so I would say knowledge ICT. So in this kind of knowledge management systems in the company are very important, right? And if you don't have that, you just can't forget about it. So this is one of the consequences of my thoughts here, right? It's a very good point. So let's continue. So the role of ICT-based knowledge management, shall we come to that point? So knowledge-based management. And then the question is, how does it change open innovation theory or innovation, the open innovation paradigm? And so we have a whole range, and it's just a limited range of questions we have to ask. Where to set up centers, right? That's a new question. How many locations? I have mentioned. How to manage the cultural differences? How to manage knowledge flows and integration among the R&D units, your question. How to manage transition from research centers and development centers and operational network of M&Es, so the funnel. And how to control, how to communicate, how to balance resources between the headquarters and the R&D sites. That's something, these are all new stuff, which is related to the globalization of R&D, but it's new for open innovation, right? And I think we have to introduce that in the open innovation literature to make open innovation relevant for multinationals. Because companies do act and do research in different countries. So they are confronted with these questions where open innovation is not giving any answer. Right? So I think it's relevant to go in that direction, right? And to make open innovation more relevant for large companies. Let's move on. The second question is the following, and it's just the opposite. How open innovation can enrich the understanding of current innovation management in multinationals. And so I think it's only a few suggestions, right? Because I think we can come up with more suggestions, and I think the wisdom of the crowd can really be valuable here, because this is work of 2 people, and I think if we think about that with 40, 50, 60 people, we come up with many more ideas. So I really challenge you to come up with more ideas than just these ideas I'm just now forwarding. So strong focus first on how to tap into external research and technology facilities. Globalization of R&D has focused on setting up R&D locations somewhere else, but has not focused on how to tap into these external sources. How do you work together with a Chinese university? How do you work together with an Indian research lab? How do you work together with a local SME, right, or local high-tech firm? Not in the United States, because we know that. We know exactly how to work here in the Valley with a small company when you're Hewlett-Packard or Microsoft, right? Henry has been explaining that in many of his cases. But I would like to see an example of how an American company is collaborating with a small SME somewhere in Israel or in China. You may be sure the challenges are probably a multiple of what we have here in the United States. So, first thing, not only internationalization of the fuzzy front end, but also all phases of the innovation funnel should be analyzed. So, focus on the value creation from innovation rather than on research and technology. So, if you look at the R&D globalization and the term is very nice. It says R&D globalization. It's only about research and development. But we should focus not only, like Henry is saying it, well, open innovation is basically about value creation. It's basically using innovation to create value, not only by product introduction, but also by selling and monetizing technology, or by decreasing R&D costs by using technologies of others, right? That's what open innovation is about. So, how you can refocus from R&D to the value creation from innovation, like Henry did, rather than research and technology development. Yeah? And so not only outside in, but also inside out. I never seen a multinational thinking in international terms about monetizing R&D using, let's say, its research that's going to be developed in other countries, except for licensing out, which is a different story, right? What is the role of headquarters or regional headquarters? Because you can have regional headquarters too. For instance, many American companies have a headquarters in Brussels for Europe, right? So headquarters or regional headquarters in different phases. So I think this role is quite different because it can change from each phase in the funnel. Give you a few examples. Licensing in and licensing out, that's typically something done by the corporate R&D IP department. And IP is usually, as far as I know, in most companies, centrally organized. So if you focus on licensing in and licensing out as one of the phases in the funnel, it's going to be probably highly centralized into a corporate department. Corporate venturing, just the same thing. So I would like to know, although R&D might be internationalized and maybe subsidiaries, or not subsidiaries, but R&D centers abroad might have a lot of power and autonomy, in other phases, in other stages of the funnel, you might have the corporate IP or the corporations or the centralized activities, centralized or staff functions might be pretty important and predominant, right? So I would like to see how this is changing over the funnel. And maybe more important is how is the coordination done over the funnel? The research, the development, IP, the corporate venturing department, because these are all different actors. And I don't know that many companies that have a real integrated way of working between the IP department, the corporate venturing department, the research department, development, and so on. And so this has to be integrated over the globe. So, and I'm not sure if this is if companies are doing it that way.
An example of venture, corporate venture,
Yeah.
is Intel Capital.
Yeah. Sure.
Has offices everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
At least 70 people working on deals.
Okay. But is this centrally done? Because I can imagine that they also.
Decision making is probably central, but at least they have spotters everywhere in the world.
Okay, so my point is, and it's pretty good you mentioned this example, my point is Intel is of course doing research too, right? So is this research globalization of Intel, how does it match with the IP and corporate venturing globalization? And how is it coordinated? Is it coordinated? I don't know. Does it need to be coordinated? That might be another question. I think yes, but I'm not sure. So these are all new questions which pop up, right? Yeah.
In that respect, to a certain extent, I think you could say that the Intel Capital and Intel Research Department
Yeah.
are integrated because a lot of the deals are probably, when they're looking for new ventures, they're probably looking for ventures that have strategic value, not
Sure.
necessarily financial value.
Sure.
So
No, sure.
For the corporation as a whole. So they're looking for technologies that are, have synergies or potential to leverage the existing technology.
Okay, I do see your point, but let me rephrase my question, right? And purely from a management point of view. If you're Intel, you see some new technology developing, right? What will be your decision? Will you co-develop with some partners from very early on? Will you co-develop that technology, or will you wait until you see one partner with a nice technology, and will you have then a minority position in that small venture, right? So that's my question, right? Will you wait or not? And is this, and that's my point, is this decision coordinated in the company? Or is this two different people, two different departments that work in an independent way? Which may, with hindsight, be coordinated, right? Because yeah, they can use this and they can use that, and finally they chose one of the two. But ex ante, they did not coordinate anything. So my question is how is that coordinated, right? Because it makes sense to have a look at that. That's also one of the critical issues in open innovation. How do you manage the whole funnel, right? So let's continue. We move to the end right now. Not only R&D department. So I'm sorry. One of the issues is not only the R&D department, but also the different internal players are crucial for decision making in different phases of the innovation funnel. That's basically what I had been saying just a minute ago. Think about licensing, think about corporate venturing, think about incubators, that's still another one, alliance departments, experience labs in companies. So they all, and many more, by the way, so they all have to be coordinated along the funnel. Who has ever heard about experience labs? You know what it is? No? A little bit, I think most people have a more technical background. If you have a look at Philips and you type in Google Experience Labs Philips, you will see that Philips nowadays is moving from a technical-oriented companies towards, let's say, lifestyle company. And what they are doing is they try to get feedback from customers in an experience, in a lab, let us say, right, where they can experience the technology and where they can give feedback on the technology in a kind of settled, in a kind of controlled environment. And so what they basically are doing, they have an experience home at Philips, an experience lab, it's called Experience Home. And in the weekends, people just come there and experience one. They have a number of experiments with this new technology, see how people react on that, just to see the human side, the human reaction, the customer reaction on this kind of technologies. So this is very important. Second is not only different internal players, but also different external players will come into the picture. So R&D globalization focus on universities, on research labs, sometimes on customers. But of course, if you move in the direction of open innovation, you should look also at the intermediaries, or what we call intermediaries, like Innocentive, Nine Sigma. You all know these guys, yeah? Venture capital funds, very, very important in open innovation. High-tech startups, very important. So we get different external partners than what the R&D globalization literature is suggesting. And of course, you get also different organizational modes to source from external sources of technology. So you have our contract R&D, you have licensing, equity and non-equity alliances, crowdsourcing, spin-ins and spin-outs. So it's not only limited to research and development departments, right? So you have a lot of possibilities, and so you have to extend this kind of literature into different directions like open innovation has been suggested before. So then finally the question, how should we structure multinationals R&D in the era of open innovation? Well, to be honest, so far, no idea. So we are exploring that in the next years with 2 PhDs. And I hope to come up with some nice ideas, but all these ideas you can bring in would be really appreciated. So if you have to write a paper, I will for sure make sure that at least my PhD, and hopefully myself too, will read the papers and see if we can get more of these from your thoughts. And the critical comments are welcome too, by the way, because this is just like an open question. I'm questioning myself, so and it's up to you to criticize. So please be welcome to criticize if necessary, right? So what I suggest is start the analysis from an overall innovation strategy. We have not mentioned that so far, but if you want to integrate the different aspects of globalization and open innovation, you have to start from an overall innovation strategy. So what is the main target of a firm's innovation? And what should be internally developed and what should be externally sourced? That's the first question. Second question is then, where should it be sourced? How should it be sourced? And so on. So but if you don't have this first question, just forget about the rest. You never come to an integrated way of thinking. Second point might be, for instance, what is the role of using intermediaries? So the technology market, which is specific for open innovation, and specialized service providers in external knowledge sensing or knowledge of technology sourcing. So not only the universities and not only the research labs, but a broader range of partners that might be crucial. And what is the role of the headquarters in several phases of the innovation funnel? I think this is a crucial question. How to internationalize R&D is only part of the picture, so the rest of the funnel should be also be analyzed. We know from the globalization literature that you have to differentiate R and D. So not necessarily to be collocated. So the development is different. It's frequently collocated with subsidiaries, not with research labs. And so we have to differentiate there. And also the location might be differentiated. And so then we have a new question, how to link research with development, right? So how to leverage and use all these innovation efforts beyond the fuzzy front end. The globalization of R&D is focusing on the fuzzy front end, but what about CVs? So what corporate venturing, licensing, and spin-ins, acquisitions, and so on? Not all R&D is equally important, so distinguish 3 capabilities and develop them accordingly. Henry has been analyzing or has been distinguishing core capabilities, critical capabilities, and the contextual capabilities. So core capabilities, of course, very important for a company. Critical capabilities can be developed with partners, and contextual capabilities is usually just a transaction-based way of insourcing. So how does this affect globalization decisions? Well, this is what Henry has been doing in a paper in 2007. So you have core, critical, and contextual capabilities, and then you see that the partner's role goes from vital, important, to almost not important. Number of partners is from none, you better do it yourself. Small number, lots of people. Depth of co-development relationship is deep, medium, and very low. And the contingency plan is best do it yourself. Partner in a win-win, based on a win-win situation, and switch to another partner if the partner is not performing because it's not a critical. So that's in a nutshell what Henry has been doing. But I think you have to use this kind of, you can use, it's only just an ID. You can use this, this way of thinking to come up with a categorization of the technology insourcing. We have codified knowledge, tacit knowledge, very crucial to make decisions on the internationalization or not. You have core capabilities, non-core capabilities, so that's like a simplification of what Henry has been suggesting as 3 capabilities. And you have the front end, so the research and the development, so the back end of the funnel. And then you can do the following thing. If you have, for instance, tacit knowledge, you can, I'm sorry about, you can read it? So you have to do it in-house, but of course it's going to be globally dispersed because it's tacit knowledge, so you have to go where the knowledge is. So, you have to work with trusted partners eventually in a joint venture, right? If it's a non-core capability, then you can, of course, it's much easier to collaborate with research partners, but you have to do it in a global way, so because it's tacit knowledge. If you have codified knowledge, which touches core capabilities, then you have to have global ICT management and do it internally. If it's non-core, you have to go for R&D contracting, which is pretty straightforward. Then if we move to the D, so to the back end of the funnel, then you can have, for instance, in-house trusted development with partnerships. If you have tacit knowledge in non-core capabilities, you can collaborate with development partners or licensing. If you have core capabilities and codified knowledge, you can go for a virtual development partnership. And if you have non-core capabilities, you just can buy in, or you can make use of an intermediary. So you see, this is kind of categorization of the different possibilities you have here. I don't say it's science-based. It's just a first thought. It's not based on a full-blown analysis, but I think this is the way you can proceed. Now, just for your information, the 2 books of Henry you know probably already. That's the book I mentioned to you, Solomon. So this is the book I have been co-editing with Henry in 2006. This is more based on, these are 2 books oriented towards management. This is oriented towards academia. We have been writing a report on open innovation for policymakers. And then we have implementing and organizing open innovation. It's a book I'm writing about managing open innovation right now. Thank you for your attention.
Fair people?
One is days. The other ones
I spoke to Professor Wall. I want to meet him next Friday. I'm not here. I'm in Boston. I have a cousin there. I want to be cold. I just want to be happy with the fact that I can apply for my For those?
All right, if someone has a few questions, we can probably give you.
So a lot of the concepts you talked about here are for large multinational companies.
Yep.
Nowadays, for open innovation, especially in software, it takes a lot less overhead. And you can see that from open source organizations
Sure.
everywhere. So how does that change in the age where doing these kind of collaborations is much less overhead? What changed and what stays the same?
Depends. I'm not sure if the overhead is drastically coming down. If you look at ICT, if you look at smaller companies, yes. But what I see is in companies is that the ICT infrastructure is used to improve, let us say, the globalization of research and development. But the performance they request from companies or from R&D laboratories is increasing too. So they're asking nowadays a 24 on 24, 7 days on 7 days performance of the R&D labs. They work 24 hours a day. So because the Indian lab is working at that time schedule, then the European lab is working that schedule, and then the American lab is working later on, so they're working 24 and 24. So what I see is that ICT is enabling quite a lot of things and is bringing down costs, but at the same time the coordination is increased dramatically, which finally is probably, according to my view, is not decreasing the overall cost of doing research and development because the requirements are just increased. So you can do a lot. Well, if you just perform the same, R&D as before, you would have a decreasing cost. But since you are increasing complexity and the fact that you're working together with different labs together at a much higher speed and so on, for much more complex forms of cooperations, just means that the overhead just stays there. And so what I see, so we have a kind of, I hope you understand that we have a kind of R&D paradox. For sure, for instance, in pharmaceutical, I don't know about ICT, but for sure in pharmaceutical companies, but also chemical companies and in other industries, you see that more and more research and development is done. The expenditures go sky high, and the sales stay at a particular level. So the R&D, so the performance of R&D is dropping instead of increasing, right? So I don't believe that much in, well, ICT is doing quite beautiful things, right? And the internet and so on, and the increase of communication, with the possibilities of communication we have nowadays is not comparable with 10 years ago. But still, research and development as such as an enterprise is changing that dramatically, that the costs are still increasing, right? And the coordination, the problems with coordination still increases. So I don't believe in this kind of potential to reduce costs, right, by ICT, because humans are from that nature that they always increase the potential. It's like a car, right? If you have a car and you can drive 100 kilometers an hour, or 50 miles an hour, then you will drive 50 miles. But if you have 100 miles an hour, then you will, of course, increase your speed, right? So people are just that way, right?
You mentioned during your presentation a couple of times the importance of culture and the differences between Europe and the US, and I happen to be from Europe as well. And
Oh, okay.
hoping to learn if you've seen a shift or if it's still static and we're still stuck in our risk-averse behavior in Europe. Is there any
Well,
push towards that? Is that better? Is that
this
worse?
this is tape recorded, so I should watch out what I'm saying. But to be honest, Europe is sick, right, on this kind of topic. We focus too much on the input side. So we have governments that invest quite a lot in the public domain, so in science, which is of course a beautiful thing. We have lots of papers, lots of publications, Nobel Prize winners, eventually some patents popping up, right? Because nowadays universities have to commercialize their R&D too. But be honest, universities are usually, not always, but usually very lousy in commercializing their IP. So Europe is focusing very much on the input side, and that's going fine. But we have what we call the European paradox: a lot of input, no output. So something is wrong there in the commercialization of the R&D, and it has to do with culture issues, the way of looking at failures, right? So we are risk averse, right? But that's only part of the game. I think we don't have the venture capital market like here in the United States. I think the best venture capital funds are still here, and you see that very good ventures from Europe come over here to get financed, not in Europe, right? It's a little bit different in the United Kingdom. There it's okay, but in continental Europe, venture capital market didn't take off that well. And that helps, of course, right? If you have a very good financial system for very risky ventures, that helps, of course. And then you have also this kind of, once you have these entrepreneurs that are successful or non-successful, doesn't matter, you have this kind of informal networks. Right? People have also this kind of examples, right, of people that tried it. If you can do it, I can do it too, right? And that helps. And so it's on that point that we should shift and I'm pretty radical on that point. We should shift the R&D policy towards more entrepreneurial policies, where also you have first, people that make money should make sure that they also can keep their money. So you should incentivize people that take risk. In Europe, of course, if you earn too much, we have it's easy in Europe to have a fiscal rate of, you call it, a tax rate of 45%. So if you earn 100,000 euros, well, that's already a lot. So if you earn 100,000 euros, you may be sure that the last 10,000 will be, or the last 20,000 will be taxed at 50% and more, right? So then you're working basically for the government, and many people are not really motivated to work. So that's one issue again. So, but I think entrepreneurship is what we should do in entrepreneurship, and also. Well, you see then if governments, like in Belgium, we do have a number of policies in the direction of stimulating entrepreneurship. But what they do then is only one part of the entrepreneurship world, let's say, stimulating the entrepreneurship. It's just stimulating the establishment of new ventures. But we know that most of the ventures just fail. So what about the successful ones? Well, the successful ones, after 3 years, have no stimulation at all, there's no measures at all. So now they're shifting in the direction of how to grow ventures, because ventures have to grow at a particular level so that they compete with foreign companies, right? And that's what is lacking. So we stimulate, let's say, startups and the establishment of small companies, but we do not stimulate, let's say, the growth of these companies. So, and of course, yeah, the market is still fragmented. So we should recognize it. How do you want to set up a venture in a market with for instance 10 million people? It's way too small. That's the advantage of China. Even though there is huge competition going on, worldwide competition going on, it's easy not easy, but I mean it's doable for Chinese to come up with a second Google in Chinese, to come up with a second Apple or an iPhone, let's say, right? So they can do that because just the market is big enough. And you will see the next Google or the next the next ICT successes will not come from Europe, but will probably come from China, because we can't see it because we can't read any Chinese, right? But a lot of these products are there, right? So they always have copies of, like the Google itself. It has a copy. Amazon has Dangdang, right? So everything has a copy in China. So I can imagine that sooner or later, one of these copies will just outperform, let's say, the original one, right? Or at least become a serious second competitor, right? So.
Has there been any research? I know that Europeans don't want to take risks, but Americans do take risks and we are more entrepreneurial.
Mm-hmm.
How about India and China? Do any studies done on those cultures that maybe the next boom, like you say, might be coming from India because they're better risk takers than Europeans?
Oh, yeah. Well, to be honest, I don't know exactly the Indian society. I've been several times in China. What you see is that Chinese people are risk takers for sure. And there's also a drive to do it because you can make a huge difference, right? So if you have poverty, right? So people, so it's like entrepreneurship is one way to get out of the struggle for life, right? So and this is also something we have to mention in Europe, and it's something which is hard to say for sure when let's say political correct language does not allow you to say it, is that in Europe you don't have this kind of struggle for life anymore, because if you're unemployed, you can stay on unemployment for years and years and years. In Belgium, for instance, France is different, right? But in Belgium, you can easily stay for 5 years on unemployment. So how do you want to have this kind of incentives to do something on your own, to start up a small venture on your own, right? Just to survive, right? And that's what you do in India. That's what you do in China, and some really succeed, right? Yeah.
I was just going to push back on a few things. There's a common misconception that American taxes are lower than Europe.
Okay.
Actually, on a total tax, or individuals are taxed completely across the board, not just corporate tax or whatever.
Okay.
A lot of European countries, particularly places like Ireland, are pay significantly lower taxes than our American colleagues. I was also on the. I'm trying not to be defensive as a Brit here. But, one thing about Chinese cultures, and perhaps less so with India, etc., which you commented earlier, was the concept of trust.
Mm-hmm.
And capitalist systems and entrepreneurship, etc., does depend on a certain level of trust. A lot of these societies, while they may be risk takers, the trust in those relationships isn't as significant as kind of Europe. So I'm wondering whether China.
I don't follow the last point on trust.
Countries, capital systems, etc., and particularly more generally entrepreneurial environments, companies, etc., depend a lot on trust.
Sure.
And a number of cultures don't have as trusted relationships as the typical American Protestant kind of company built on.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just wondering whether trust is going to be an issue for countries like China when they do actually become a lot more, when you do get a lot more Chinese companies being built in.
Okay, that's an open question. I don't want to defend myself on that point. So it could be that you're right. So and it's an issue then, right? On the tax issues, it might be right. I don't know, right? But we are taxed directly on the labor, right? So directly, if you earn 100,000, you will see that you only have, let's say, 55 in your pocket, and it's that which is destimulating. That takes away this incentives to do something with your money. I can imagine that like for instance in Belgium we don't pay that much for Social Security, right? Or for instance for a health insurance, right? For health insurance in Belgium, that's really a luxury. I pay about 25 euros a year. So you can imagine, but I do pay because I pay all my taxes, right? So, but of course in the United States you're going to pay an awful lot more. but that's like an expenditure. That's not deducted from your money, right? From your loan, from your wage. Sorry, and that makes it so painful in Europe. So even when you earn a lot, you will see nothing in your hand, and that's the incentive, right? The perception. Yeah.
At lunch we were talking, and I said this open innovation model works wonderfully in the countries where there's trust. But this open innovation model, as far as I'm concerned, in India and China, I don't think it'll work. Because we just steal and we abuse, and it doesn't happen. I think it works wonderfully when there's fairness, when there's trade, we give, we cross-license and there's trust, and we value the other person. Yes, it works well here, but it doesn't work well over there.
Yet, though, right?
Yeah. But there's a critical mass, though. I mean, the critical mass, we're dealing with masses. The rest of the world lives elsewhere, not here.
But this is indeed, if this is true, right? If there is no an IP system, no trustable IP system which you can enforce in the United States, in China or India, and people steal away what others have been inventing, then of course open innovation makes no sense, and so we do have a real problem there. Yeah.
I find it weird that you talk about stealing ideas, and in India they steal more than here. But like even in the US, or like I studied in France, like everywhere they steal. The only difference that you have a legal system that protects or not. Like you have Apple that steals, you have like Microsoft that steals a lot of ideas. Why only like China and India and saying it's not going to work in India?
Well, the risk is always that you have to that you can, if you infringe patents, you can face a lawsuit, right? And this is the case in the United States. Probably yes, in Europe yes, but in India probably not. And for sure in China it's not the case. But what I do see is that Chinese companies, if they start working on knowledge, on their own knowledge, and they need the they need an IP system to protect their own knowledge, then they're going to change. So I'm not sure that the stealing from today will be the stealing of tomorrow, because probably the whole system has to change to protect the IP of Chinese companies and Indian companies.
Okay, so it's more about like the legal system than the human nature of the human entity. That's what I wanted to say.
Well,
It's not because like Americans don't steal and Indians steal. You know?
Oh yeah, okay.
In one part you have a legal system.
Oh,
and the
but
other part
it's not difficult. Take away the legal system here. Assume it will be corrupt. Then you will see companies stealing all the time, right? So it's a legal system that you need.
It's not intrinsic to
And
Exactly.
and the
That's what I want to say.
and the enforceability of
Like
the
the way
system.
you said it was
Because China has an IP system, right? And has an IP control system, but it's not enforceable. That's the problem.
Actually, it is kind of a cultural thing.
Yeah, it is.
Yes.
Very deep-seated.
Yes, because for example, in China, they have a whole history of sharing stuff. For example, people do things for the People's Republic, so all people's benefit. So people could, for example, interpret if a large company has a monopoly on something, they feel that they are entitled, for example, to steal an idea and to go forward with that because it's for the people's greater good of China. You know, why should a local community not benefit from that? It's a whole different way of thinking, which is rooted in the cultural history of the country. It's just a small example.
What I learned from this debate is it should be analyzed, right?
That's right, yeah, there you go.
Right?